tell you. As some of you guys have heard a presentation I gave about a year and a half ago. And as Gunilla said, I have been spending quite a bit of time in the Olympic Village. It's a neighborhood that many of you will probably be familiar with if you've lived in Vancouver for a while, but even if you haven't, a lot of people find themselves wandering through this area of the city. And it's obviously by this picture a place that's undergone an incredible transformation. If you've been in the village lately, you'll know Kraft, there's the salt building now, it's a bit of a pub there. You can see in the top right corner, that's where the salt building was in 1947. You can see the shoreline has changed incredibly since then. It's undergone, as I said, an incredible transformation. It was once the industrial heart of Vancouver, home to shipbuilding companies as well as other industries. And this industry changed quite a bit over time, faded out in the 70s and 80s, and in 1990, Municipal Council decided that this would be an ideal place, as much of the land was city-owned, to start thinking about how to try to build energy-efficient communities. And this was in response to the global climate. And eventually had the ultimate goal of becoming Vancouver's first sustainable urban community. And it was finished in 2009 and awarded a LEED Platinum designation for neighborhood development. So, and the design and the construction of this village is actually a point in a broader trend that's been emerging across the world. Sustainable neighborhoods or sustainable urban villages have been increasing in number. They're heralded by many as a potentially very powerful and potent locale or incubator for thinking about new ways of thinking about and designing sustainable communities. And many people are thinking that these are ideal test beds or trial grounds to actually start affecting a broader transformation in sustainability at larger scales in the urban environment or in our systems and societies more generally. But there are several questions that actually remain as to the accreditation, the performance, and the evaluation of these projects. For example, we might affix a LEED designation or a LEED Platinum designation to a neighborhood, but is it actually performing the way that its planners and designers actually intended it to? We're finding that in many cases, just like sustainable buildings, they aren't actually reaching the same level of performance necessarily. And in terms of assessment or evaluation, I've also found that in most of the work that's been done, mostly quantitative measures of performance are being used to evaluate these projects, much to the neglect of the experiential, the qualitative, or the social dimensions of actually living in or working in these projects, which are, of course, equally important to consider. So this is what turned me to the concept of narrative as a way of trying to answer some of these questions and fill some of the gaps around our understanding of sustainable neighborhoods. Narrative at its very basic level can be thought of as the underlying structure and meaning embedded in the stories that we tell, whether those stories might be told in person, in a conversation, in a piece of poetry or prose, or even in a policy document or planning text. So to explore narrative then is to actually gain insight into the way that someone or some group, some city, some group of planners, for example, actually think about and understand the world, including the values and the worldviews through which they might see it. Narrative is already being used essentially what I did was trace about 30 years of planning and policy text at the City of Vancouver, as well as planning and policy text specific to the Olympic Village, and compared what I called the official narrative that came out of these texts with the media narrative and the counter narrative that were presented in about 50 years of coverage surrounding the Olympic Village. to living with livability. So by harmonizing livability goals that with newer emissions reduction and overall sustainability targets. The Olympic Village in particular was presented as a pilot project that would be important to trial new infrastructures and new ways of, or new technologies, new ways of planning, and that would act as a learning opportunity and a catalyst for change. There to understand how sustainability and sustainable neighborhoods were being understood from different perspectives at the institutional scale. I wanted to understand how these actually played out with regards to the built environment, what was ultimately constructed and what was used in the buildings and in the landscape, and how these went on to affect some kind of change or not in the way that lives have been lived. And so what I did is to explore this more performative dimension of the neighborhood was to look at how some of the lived narratives might be reinforcing or contesting or even overwriting the story of what the village was originally intended to be. So I use this idea of lived narratives as a way of capturing the experiences of people who actually live and work in the neighborhood. So to begin this exploration, I first had to look at what the village actually is today as it stands. I won't go into too much detail, but if you walk through the neighborhood, you can tell that it's visibly different from others in the central area. It has a much lower building form. It's a maximum of about 12 stories, and 12 stories in the village, 18 stories in Southeast False Creek, a much lower building height than, for example, Yaletown or Cole Harbour. We have a mixed-use design that combines residential and commercial uses centered around a central plaza. The buildings themselves are built around central courtyards in a parcel form and have been built in such a way as to try to reduce energy use and other resource use while simultaneously ensuring the comfort of its residents and utility provision at relatively low cost. And the way that planners and designers attempted to do this, or architects and designers I should say, was by incorporating a number of novel technologies in the buildings, some not so novel like low flow fixtures, others a little bit more innovative such as a very interesting form of heat provision that uses a mesh of plastic tubes installed in the ceiling and then circulating hot and cold water through these tubes. And finally, on the right, you also have external blinds that regulate incoming solar radiation. They go up and down automatically according to how much light is incoming, but can also be controlled by residents. So to find out how these and other dimensions of village life had actually intervened into the daily lives and practices of people living and working there, I conducted about 40 interviews with both residents and managers. Managers I use as a term fairly broadly. It encompasses anything from maintenance coordinators to housing managers and technicians. And I spoke to residents and managers from all four housing types, so from high-end suites in strata, condos, to low-income households, just to get a very broad range of perspectives across the village. So what I'll do in the second half of the presentation then is go a little bit into detail about how lives had actually been changed since coming to the village or not. So I'll start with residents. First of all, it became very clear from my interviews with people that since coming to live in the village, their mobility practices had shifted fairly significantly. People spoke fairly broadly across my interviews and at length about their ability to get around without the use of a car. Some people were able to sell their car or one of their cars and get around much more easily on foot, by bike, also public transportation and car share options that are also available in the neighborhood. This is obviously a function of its mixed-use design as well as its connectivity to other parts of the central area. It was secondly clear that people were able to live more in place than they were previously. This is something that I heard again across my interviews. It was the number one thing that people seemed to appreciate about their neighborhood, and something that many had not experienced coming from other parts of Metro Vancouver or in other places around BC. And finally, both the design of the neighborhood and of the buildings themselves had also evidently fostered a shift in the way people were able to socialize. People spoke to their ability to meet their neighbor more frequently. They knew more people than they did in other places that they'd lived. And this was something that I heard predominantly from the townhouse units, which are sort of physically a much more intimate structure, as well as the co-op, which is a deliberately more communal structure form of housing. But it was something that I heard from across my interviews. So what these dimensions of life in the village then started to tell me that was, at least in some ways, since coming to live in the village had shifted certain practices both towards more enjoyable, healthier, and also more sustainable forms. People were able to live in place, they knew more people, and they were getting around without automotive modes of transportation. What I did notice, though, is that in my interviews with both residents and managers of the low-income housing units is that this is not an experience that was uniform. And in particular, low-income households were having difficulty living in place to the same extent. This is predominantly because of the high price point of the amenities that are in place in the village. You have Terra Breads, London Drugs, and Urban Fare is the local grocery store, that are just above and beyond what a low-income household can afford typically. Certain lower mobility residents, such as very elderly or people with disabilities, had difficulty still getting around, and this was also a demographic that was feeling less connected overall. So not a uniform picture. And then there was also the dimension of life inside the units. So these were sort of neighborhood scale practices, how people got around in their daily lives outside their units. But within their units, I heard a lot of stories about the difficulties that people were facing engaging in daily habits and routines, and this was largely a function of the technologies that had been installed there. And the biggest or the strongest example of where this was the case was in residents' ability to achieve their thermal comfort inside their units, either getting warm enough in winter or cool enough in summer. The system itself was quite confusing to people. It was something that people were unfamiliar with. For example, it replaces a thermostat that controls air temperature with a dial that controls the rate of water through a mesh of tubes, so either hot or cold water. People found it quite counterintuitive and confusing as to how to actually achieve a level of comfort. And so what many people did was actually replace, or they would just bring in old habits of adjusting temperature that wouldn't actually work in their units because of slow response times, or they would just simply circumvent the system altogether, bring in air conditioners or fans or heaters when they became too frustrated. Another example of where practices have been disrupted, sort of unsuccessfully, is in both washing up and bathing, as many residents complained about what they felt was an excessively long wait time to get hot water up until their units. People were waiting an average of 90 seconds to upwards of a few minutes to get hot water. This is mostly in the morning, but any time of day. And again, many people have adapted to this by bringing in old habits or even making new ones, but some have actually gone ahead and just removed the fixtures altogether. So these are the kinds of adaptations and practices that show that, in certain ways, the design of the village has intervened into practices in such a way that neither livability, so convenience or comfort, goals have been achieved, nor sustainability, as resources are not being conserved. And in some cases, it's actually led to higher utility costs overall, which is again a problem for low-income residents. Whoa, okay. I'll blast through this. So what I do want to note, though, is that some of the issues that people have not been necessarily the result of technologies themselves, but errors or problems in their maintenance and their installation. This is where speaking to managers became really important, because they were the ones working behind the scenes trying to get an understanding of how these systems should work. And in talking to them, I heard many stories about complex, integrated, unfamiliar systems that managers were unprepared to deal with. I heard stories about the faulty installation of certain technologies. For example, the blinds, the external blinds that are meant to go up and down automatically, have in some cases been installed improperly, leading to malfunctions. And in many cases, very little information or support was available. What this has led to then is an incredible challenge for management across the village in all building types. They've invested an incredible amount of time and effort into getting the systems up and running the way that they're intended to. And this has been especially a problem for strata councils because these are people who are working on volunteer basis who have very little expertise or understanding of what it is that they're dealing with. But even those who were better, had expertise and training found it challenging. It's also making for higher costs overall, not just because of the materials, things like the glass facade used on the co-op here, which are quite expensive to replace when they get damaged, but just managers are paying for the time that it takes themselves and the trades to get up to speed on these systems. So it's been quite an investment on all fronts. I did go back about a year later, so this was early 2014 when I first spoke to everyone. I went back this spring and I was quite happy to hear that most of the major technical issues, things like the blinds, solar panels, other issues had been resolved largely. Maintenance and operations procedures were finally being put in place. Things were starting to run more smoothly. And managers were communicating much better across and within parcels. So in actually developing a more collaborative form of management, they were saving time and money and frustration as they were able to share lessons and bring everyone up to a common level. However, some issues have remained a problem, especially on some of the more complicated parcels with multiple actors. I just have a few more slides. The experiences that I've spoken about definitely paint sort of a complicated picture. In some cases, things have been working very well. In other cases, they haven't been working so well at all. But in my conversations with both residents and managers, something started to emerge that was quite interesting to me that led me to think about the social processes involved in achieving some of these sustainability goals. And this is because at the end of my interviews, when I asked people, well, what would you do to actually make the neighborhood better? I often got responses like this one, which is that despite this long list of problems, they loved the neighborhood, they would never leave, and you couldn't make them leave if you tried to. So there was a real sense of loyalty and appreciation for the neighborhood that that the high quality of the landscape and of the planning, I think, itself has helped to foster. So this has acted as a bit of an anchor, keeping people around during harder times. A second issue that came up that I found also was quite interesting is that in some ways the struggles that people were facing there have actually paradoxically helped to encourage or develop this sense of place and this sense of community even further. There's lots of forums that are emerging both online, like the Southeast Falls Creek Neighborhood Facebook page, as well as offline, that are helping or that are being created to help residents sort through some of the issues with their units or their technologies that they don't understand. And it's bringing everyone up to a common level of understanding and getting to a point where things are working better, but it's also fostering more social interaction and encouraging that. I just have one more minute, so I'll just blast through this. So what does all this basically tell us about sustainable neighborhoods and how to assess them? Well, I think the research that I've conducted shows the utility, or certainly the usefulness, of getting into this more in-depth sort of narrative understanding of what is actually going on in a place like this. It's important to couple these kinds of qualitative approaches with more quantitative approaches to get to the reasons why certain buildings and neighborhoods may not be performing the way that they were intended to, and to actually bring them up into that level. And I'll just end with one slide then with some lessons from the research in terms of, well, how do we actually harness the transformative potential of the neighborhood a little bit further? Certainly adopting a more qualitative approach to assessment, but also a more procedural approach to assessment, something that is ongoing. The building doesn't end at construction or at certification. It's something that continues to evolve as people adapt to their environments, respond to them, and in fact change the systems themselves. So an ongoing form of commissioning and assessment is important to actually capture and even anticipate some of these changes. Second, it was great to see that there were a lot of emergent social forums for interaction that are helping people to understand and get to know their systems, but at the same time there's an obvious opportunity to create these more deliberately. mostly to avoid some of the larger frustrations that people have experienced. This has been, it's been a real headache for many people to get to where they are today. So to avoid that, at least in some part, would be beneficial. An issue I didn't talk about today was low-income housing units, the amount of low-income housing provided in general. I mean, this is something that was a huge issue in the village that I'm happy to speak to, but research shows it's not simply enough to include a certain percentage or number of units, but also to ensure that the amenities and the structures that are in the village are there to actually support low-income households once they're there. And finally, from the experiences of managers, it's obvious that a more careful process and a softer landing for building management, something that would have helped them get the information that they needed and get the systems running the way they were intended to, again, without as much of a headache as they experienced. And that is all I've got. Thank you. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's in one of my recommendations, and the conclusion would be to actually get such a stewardship group up and running faster. I'm not sure that it will ever emerge. I mean, in part, it has emerged in little pockets spontaneously through the actions of individuals, but is there one coordinated group that is there specifically to help, realize the vision? No. So I do think that that would have been very useful. It may be that they're waiting for the entire neighborhood to be constructed, because it was supposed to be the Southeast False Creek stewardship group, and the Olympic Village is just one part. They're still building out incredibly. So it may be that it will still come down the line, but it would certainly, I think, have been appropriate to put that in sooner to get that up and running. Tiny. The people I spoke with, which is a fairly small sample, but my sense and I also spoke with Bob Rennie, and so the real estate marketer, so he knows who bought there. The neighborhood is made up of downsizing retirees, so people who had larger homes in West Van or other parts of the Lower Mainland, who have downsized into condos, who want to live more centrally. When they dropped the prices by about a third in the second round of condo sales, then you had a younger sort of investment crowd come in. So you have quite a few families. People were aware of the sustainability narrative, but it was not the primary driver for them to come. It was cost when they dropped the price. It was location, convenience, view, all the things that make people want to live where they do. So everyone was aware, and it actually made many people a bit wary of coming because of all the bad press, but it was not really a pull. The only place where it was actually a factor was in the co-op, which is made up of like 50% RMES grads, and the other 50% are environmental engineers and all kinds of architects and all kinds of other young professionals who are quite sustainability minded. Oh, sorry. I mean, I think it depends on the building. I mean, in terms of class, I mean, the total number of units in the Olympic Village is around 1,100. Only 100 of those are low-income housing. Everything else is a condo or a market rental. So, or the co-op, which is the most expensive co-op in Canada and possibly North America. So, class, like the class division there is, you know, fairly stark. The nice part is that you kind of can't tell by walking through the neighborhood which building is which. And I think that's actually, I mean, if you went inside, you could tell, but because the actual fixtures in the low-income buildings and in the co-op are quite a bit of lower quality. But in terms of the buildings themselves, all of them have been constructed to foster some sort of communal social interaction. So, you know, balconies have been moved to the exterior. You know, you have inner courtyards, you have things like that. But you also have more, you know, social spaces in the neighborhood as well. So, like interactive furniture and the plaza and things like that. Like those are all accessible to everyone. So I don't know that class would enter that as much. What I will say though is that anyone can do this. I mean, if you're interested, but you can stalk people on the Facebook page because it's public, which I have done extensively. And one of the major conversations there is this constant battle between those who think that social housing and affordable housing should be nowhere near them and those who think that there should be more of it close by. So there's a real sort of battle going on between those, basically around this idea of how our spaces should be used and what kind of affordability options should be given. I think there is something to what you're saying. I mean, I'm loath to comment on it too extensively. I think we'll talk about it after. Okay. Oh, good. Nailed it. We can go outside.